I'm Dr. Daniel Thomas. This is my second year at University of Kansas, assistant professor in the Department of Curriculum and Teaching. I'm also the social studies program coordinator for secondary educators. I look at the history of Black education, right? And particularly, I'm looking at the history of anti-Black racialized discourse. And I'm trying to find the connections between these several centuries of anti-Black racialized discourse and the contemporary experiences of Black men and boys in education. The premise of the study is to look at how 20th century sociological research has essentially inscribed, it's encoded, it's developed this script, this meta-narrative that has completely saturated the way that we can understand the purpose, the utility of Black men in schools, right? And so a lot of these studies that are coming up in the early 20th century are essentially framing any issue around Black education or achievement around a single figure or a figure who's not really there. And that is the Black father, right? And it is some really methodologically inaccurate, overtly racist studies that are coming out. Anthony Brown was the third co-author, and he had published an earlier study that did like a systemic analysis of this sociological anthropological research that was done from about the early 1900s up until about the 1990s. And he came up with 4 themes that emerged from that. They were either framed as absent and wandering, impotent and powerless, soulful and adaptive, or endangered and in crisis. So we kind of used his initial thematic findings to that kind of discursive analysis, and then we wanted to look at films that featured Black male teachers. Some of the movies that we looked at, out of the 10, the earliest one we looked at from like the late 1960s, that was Sidney Poitier in To Serve With Love. Some of the other ones were Higher Learning, Menace II Society, Major Pain, and everybody's pretty familiar with Lean on Me, right? So those were some of the movies that we looked at. And we wanted to see if those 4 sociological themes stuck, and they were consistent throughout all of them. So the only time that those 4 theoretical findings did not emerge is when the student was white. And so that would be the Nutty Professor. His kind of lab assistant is Jason, and Jason is fully capable of everything. It's almost like they're partners. He's competent, right? There's nothing said about his family, nothing ill or anything like that. But in all the other films, all of the 10, all roads lead back to the same sociological notions that were brought up about absent Black fathers. So we think about things that can change in Hollywood, right? Really, it's just taking a more accurate focus or representation on the array of other aspects that are impacting education, particularly Black urban education, right? Housing, the history of anti-Blackness, redlining, redistricting, property taxes, all these other factors that play a significant role. Hollywood should tend to those as well. Individuals are not going to produce these like multi-million-dollar budget films unless it's going to garner profit, right? So anytime, even though you might have Black producers or writers or screen directors who are making these films, you must be asking yourselves, why is this movie being put out for public consumption, right? To what end, to what extent? What is the true purpose? These early sociological studies from the early 20th century to the present profoundly impacted public policy, the ways in which we fund schools, the type of textbooks that we produce, right? So this scholarship can be quite problematic, right? If it is not done with a certain amount of intellectual integrity and a particular moral purpose behind it, right? So if you are working with a population when you think about Black men and boys, make sure you're putting their epistemological perspective at the forefront, and make sure that you have a level of intellectual integrity and moral aptitude to do the right thing when you take their data, when you take their stories, when you take their narratives. How are you shaping it and pushing that back out to the public, right? As we can see, through these films, that can be deeply problematic, but at the same time can be quite transformative and revolutionary too, if done in the right way.